Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in to our presentation. My name is Finnegan, and I'm here with my co-author, Julius Andersson. We'll present our project for the workshop. The title of the project, tentative title, is Industrial Energy Policy in Rapid Decarbonization, the Case of France. So I should mention this project is at a very early stage, and so any and all feedback is really welcome and really help us to revise it for the next version. So the motivation for this work is thinking through how to bring the state back in to questions of climate policy and climate politics. Markets have received much attention in climate policy discussion for the last 3 decades. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of that. There's been a massive focus on carbon pricing in particular. We want to broaden the conversation a bit and think about the role of the state here and how the state can actively reshape the economy to reduce emissions. Now, states have played an active role in energy and climate policy to date. We don't dispute that, and we think they'll also continue to do so. However, again, we don't think they've received as much attention, especially the effects of state intervention haven't received as much attention as they're likely due. Only states have the capacity for enacting radical and rapid economic change, we think, right? Because states can coordinate economic activity across the entire country. And then there are also lingering doubts for us about whether carbon pricing alone can generate the change we need. So one way that we're thinking about state intervention is through industrial policy. I'll say a little bit more about what we mean by industrial policy in a second. But here we're trying to tie into this kind of renaissance of thinking about industrial policy that's happening now in the literature. This really kind of started after the financial crisis, but now in terms of economic recovery from the pandemic, industrial policy has really become sort of front and center. And so we want to think about this and contribute to this debate. I want to just flag right off the bat that we're not bashing carbon markets or carbon pricing. We think they're important. Indeed, Julius wrote a very, actually an award-winning paper just recently about the effects of carbon taxes. But again, this is about broadening the debate and thinking about complementary ways that states can intervene to really radically reduce emissions and reshape the economy. So what do we mean by industrial policy? Now, this is a bit of a nebulous term, and there are many different kind of definitions out there. What we mean are policies that specify and solve problems of structural change in the economy, and the task of industrial policy is to create optimum conditions for the necessary structural transformations to be carried out. And we also like Paul Krugman and his co-authors' definition that industrial policy is an attempt by a government to encourage resources to move into particular sectors that the government views as important to future economic growth. And so from these definitions and others, we can think about industrial policy as strategic government intervention in markets to address structural problems in the economy. So previously, these were things like economic development or over-reliance on imports or changing patterns of international trade. So this is what the government's trying to address. And it addresses these structural problems primarily through creating national firms or incubating national firms and technologies that then become internationally competitive. And what this does is it ensures the future prosperity for the country, also generates domestic employment, and can also maintain or increase international political power. There's also sort of geopolitics to industrial policy, which we think is important. Now, industrial policy is related to command and control, but we don't think it's the same thing. So command and control, we think, is a narrower policy instrument, where industrial policy is a broader, sort of broader vision in terms of scale and goals. And so as part of a broad industrial policy, you might use a command and control strategy. That's the way we're thinking about it. Now, most recently, the term or concept of green industrial policy has emerged as a way to address climate change. It's particularly Danny Roderick's work, but also a recent specialist in global environmental politics, which some of you may have seen, was dedicated to green industrial policy. And the idea here is much the same way with traditional industrial policy. The state gets mobilized, but here it's for decarbonization. And in order to sort of achieve decarbonization, at the same time, the state is creating national champions, national firms, internationally competitive technologies, jobs, growth, et cetera. It's an entire industrial vision for the country. And this ties in also to policy paradigms like Green New Deals, green growth. And we can see a very recent example of this, the EU's industrial strategy here, a document that just came out recently. And so we see this is about a new industrial strategy for the EU, for Europe, that's globally competitive, right? First and foremost, it's globally competitive and also green and digital. So what we're trying to do in this paper, kind of trying to do a real interdisciplinary paper where we're bringing together economics and political science. And the economics part is about, we use for sort of the empirical assessment. So kind of part one of the paper. This is trying to look at the effects of industrial policy. So what is the potential for rapid CO2 emissions reductions through industrial policy? And then what other economic benefits can be generated beyond emission reductions? And so that's really, again, an exercise in policy evaluation, empirical exercise. And then in part two, we want to look at the politics, right? You might have a policy that's very economically promising and efficient, but if the political conditions aren't right and it's not politically feasible, then it really doesn't matter at all, right? Because it won't be enacted. And if it is enacted, it'll be reversed. So the second part for us, so the second question is, what political conditions are needed to enable industrial policy? And so we study the case of industrial energy policy in France to answer these questions. And in particular, we do a case study on France's Mesmer plan. And so this was a plan, energy plan, or what we're calling industrial energy policy, announced by the Prime Minister, Pierre Mesmer, in 1974. And it's basically France's response to the 1973 oil price shock, right, where the price of oil quadrupled in a matter of months. And the goal of the Mesmer plan was to generate all of the country's electricity from nuclear energy over the coming decades. And there are a few sort of very famous quotes from this time. So one was from a government communication where the government says, in France, we may not have oil, but we have ideas. And then Mesmer himself says, all electric, all nuclear, as the kind of slogan for the plan. Now, there were a number of kind of underlying aims. And so, of course, the first is energy security. So the government was facing a major, the whole world, including France, was facing a major energy crisis. And particularly in France, this was very salient because the country had become reliant on imported oil. And the country has little domestic oil or coal resources. And so change was needed. Once the price of imported oil had quadrupled, there was really a need for change in the domestic energy system. So this links to these ideas that crisis, exogenous shocks and crises can lead to reform. That's definitely the first piece here. But then the Mesmer plan linked up with a broader industrial vision or strategy that France had to create national champions, so internationally competitive national firms in nuclear technology for success in international marketplaces, and also create domestic employment and growth. And then lastly, there was a political power piece here, a geopolitics piece. And this was to ensure French sovereignty and independence in energy and technology. And if you look at the discourse around the plan, there was really a sense that through the plan, France could achieve kind of industrial prowess, and by doing so, kind of reassert itself as a global power and sort of reassert its sovereignty, right? This is off the back of France facing quite a humiliating defeat in World War II. So that's the case study, and now I'll turn it over to Julius for the empirical analysis.
Okay, so let's try to see if we can answer the first question on what happened after the Mesmer plan was implemented, what happened to CO2 emissions. So I want you to see this first figure here to the right here. This shows the share of total electricity and heat production on the y-axis, and on the x-axis it's the years from 1960 until 2005, and this is the sample period that we are looking at. And the red solid line here is the share of electricity and heat production coming from fossil fuels, and the blue line is the share coming from nuclear. And we can see that around the time of 1980, when the first new plants came online, that was an effect of the Mesmer plan, there's a rapid increase in the share of nuclear. So, but between 1979 and 1988, the number of reactors increased from 16 to 55 in France. And by early 1990, around 80% of the electricity was now generated using nuclear. And the share of fossil fuels dropped from 60% down to less than 10% during the same time period. So what then happened to CO2 emissions? Well, the interesting question is what is the causal effect of the Mesmer plan on CO2 emissions? And the challenge to answer that question is to find a counterfactual. What happened in France if the Mesmer plan would not have been implemented? So one way to answer that would be to have some countries that would be similar to the France and see how emissions evolved in those countries. So here in the figure to the right, we have France as the solid black line, and this is CO2 emissions per capita from electricity and heat production, again from 1960 to 2005. And now the dashed black line here is just the average, simple average of CO2 emissions from OECD countries that are similar high-income democracies. So these are all the countries that were OECD members in 1973, at the time of the 1973 oil crisis. So what we can see that emissions track each other fairly well from 1960 to 1973, not that well in the time period from 1973 up until 1980. So one could look at this graph and say, well, the Mesmer plan led to large reductions in emissions, but the counterfactual scenario is not that convincing. So I think we could do better than just using a simple average. So our solution is to do using the synthetic control method. So we synthesize the counterfactual. And this synthetic France is a weighted combination of this OECD sample of countries. So what do we do then? Well, you specify certain predictors of emissions, and you then get a set of weights. So here, there are only 5 countries that receive a positive weights in synthetic France. So Belgium receives the largest with more than 1/3, and then we have Austria, Switzerland, Portugal, and Germany with weights declining in that order. So these 5 countries makes up our counterfactual synthetic France. So what you can see also is that there's no extrapolation here. You're not allowed to give weights larger than 1 or negative weights. They're all between 0 and 1, and if you add them all together, they sum to 1. So that is synthetic France. And then we can see now, if we compare in the figure to the left here, the evolution of emissions. Again, France is the solid black line, and our counterfactual this time is this weighted average synthetic France. Now we see that there's a very good fit, both in the pre-treatment period up until 1973, but also in the time period between 1973 and 1980, where we would expect that these two lines would follow each other, because there were no new nuclear plants that came online due to the Mesmer plan. But then starting in 1980, as the new first plants come online, emissions in France drop relative to its counterfactual. And from mid-1980s or 1990s and onwards, there's quite a large emission reductions that we could attribute to the Mesmer plan. And how large this is, we can see in the figure to the right. So this figure shows the difference between the 2 lines in the left. So this is basically the gap in emissions between France and synthetic France. And we can see that this fluctuates around 0 from 1960 up until 1980. And then as new nuclear plants come online due to the Mesmer plan, we see a drop in emissions in France relative to its counterfactual. And on average, between 1980 to 2005, there's around 1 metric ton of CO2 emissions less emitted in France. And this is a drop in emissions of around 62%. But this is, of course, just looking at electricity and heat production. So what happened to emissions in total? So this figure here shows, again, CO2 per capita, but now it's looking at total emissions from the entire economy. And again, we're looking at from 1960 to 2005. And here we again see that France and its synthetic counterpart track each other fairly closely, or very closely, I would say, in the pre-treatment period, but also in the time period from 1973 up until 1980. And on average, we have a total reduction in CO2 emissions of 23% in an average year from 1980 to 2005. But then if we look at the effects on economic growth and jobs, here it's a little bit harder, or maybe we should be more careful in making causal claims here. But what we can see here, at least in the figure to the left, if we start with that, this is GDP per capita in real terms. Again, it's going from 1960 to 2005. We can see that GDP per capita followed a very similar trajectory up until 1973 in France, in synthetic France. After that, GDP is slightly higher in France going forward up until around mid-1980s, and thereafter it's lower. So if anything, we can at least say that there is no boost in GDP growth in France relative to its counterfactual due to the Mesmer Plan. And this is also mirrored in when we look at unemployment. We see that unemployment here in the figure to the right follow each other quite well from 1960 to 1980, similar levels of unemployment, but from 1980s and onwards, unemployment is significantly higher as a percentage of the total labor force in France relative to its synthetic counterfactual. And lastly, if we look at industry, it was actually, here we can see quite clear evidence that France became a leader in nuclear manufacturing and technology. So Framatome, a French company that builds nuclear reactors, has built more reactors than any company in the world. And if we look at patents, France has around 8% of all this related to nuclear energy, but they're behind the US and Japan and Germany. But if we look at nuclear technology patents relative to all technology patents, here we see that France is again a leader. This ratio, we find that France has the highest ratio here. It's the most specialized country in nuclear energy technology. Okay, so I'll leave it over now to Jared again to talk about the politics of industrial policy.
So we find this effect that the Mesmer Plan reduced emissions, and so now what we try to do is uncover the kind of political conditions that enabled this industrial policy to be implemented. So as I said before, it's really not enough that a policy is kind of economically promising or has some industrial vision for the country. It has to be politically feasible as well. So there are a few conditions that we identify that we think were particularly useful for the politics. So one was an exogenous shock. So you have this price shock on a commodity, on an energy commodity that was used widely in France. France had become very dependent on, and the price of this quadruples within a couple of months. This crisis period really induced and sort of made salient the need for reform, right? Something has to be done. So that's one important piece. Also, it's important to point out that France has existing nuclear capacity. So France is a nuclear power. It began developing nuclear weapons during the war, and as well as a civilian nuclear energy program. And so by 1973, there was already sort of institutional capacity for nuclear R&D, a regulatory framework for nuclear energy, and manufacturing companies. So Framatome was already set up by the time 1973 comes around. And so what you have is a kind of latent sort of institutional landscape that really gets accelerated as a result of the price shock. Then perhaps most importantly, in France, you have a very insulated policymaking environment. And so, especially during this period, so this was the period of dirigism in France, right? State-led technocratic policymaking. So you have a centralized statist policy style that shuts out policy losers, right? This is very important for the politics, right? If you want to do a major change in the economy, oftentimes there are losers from that kind of policy decision. So the extent to which you're able to insulate policymaking from those losers will increase the chances of success. And so this is exactly what we see in the French case. So again, state-led technocratic decision-making from within the ministries. It was a very depoliticized process, and so there was cross-party consensus that the state had to move in this direction, and there was little elite polarization on this, right? Indeed, it was kind of quiet politics. Parties weren't really involved, and there was no parliamentary debate, if you could believe it. So massive industrial energy policy, and it's not debated in parliament. There are citizens' protests, especially at the sites where nuclear reactors are going to be built. Sometimes these were very violent, but the French government basically just steamrolled them and built the reactors anyways. Another important piece here is the embeddedness between the state and business, especially in the energy sector. And so you have the Ministry of Industry, which coordinates the Mesmer Plan, and there's also the nuclear regulator. and that obviously is within the purview of the state and state power. You also have the CEA, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is a public research institute that had already been developed, and this was the kind of R&D arm of the government. And so this was the institute involved in bringing basic research in nuclear technology and bringing those to market. And again, that was within the purview of the state. And then you have some important private sector actors. So the utility, EDF, which is the one utility in France. So the whole grid is centralized and EDF controls it in this period. Now EDF's a private company, but it's majority state owned. So the state obviously has a heavy hand in the company. And the same with Framatome. So Framatome was already set up by this time. It's a manufacturer of nuclear reactors. It's a private company, but again, the state has a majority ownership in it. And so what we can see very clearly then is that when business interests perhaps are opposed to the Mesmer plan, the government can work with business to overcome and resolve any disagreements, and especially do this privately. And so, open political disputes about the plan don't spill out into the public. And then lastly, the Mesmer plan really aligns with a larger industrial vision that France has, and sort of larger goals of the state around energy security and independence, becoming a leader in nuclear energy and technology, ideas about national sovereignty in France, sort of becoming energy independent, not having to rely on anyone else for its energy, creating national champions in nuclear technology, enhancing its own industrial power and its own global economic competitiveness, and then of course also domestic economic growth and job creation.
Yeah, and then we would just like to end with one slide here that shows that there are many similarities with the oil crisis in the early 1970s and what is happening now in the current energy crisis. So in both cases, there was an exogenous shock. Today, it's the war in Ukraine, and back then it was the Yom Kippur War, which was a conflict between Israel and a coalition of Arab countries led by Egypt and Syria. And then that was followed by an oil embargo. Today, it's against Russian oil. Back then, it was against countries that supported Israel in this conflict. That was followed by rapid increases in energy prices, which led to an energy crisis. Followed by this is a question of, or the issue of energy independence becomes a much more salient political issue. One big difference, we argue here, is that today we also have two crises at the same time. So there's an energy crisis and there's the climate crisis. And this is important because all the short-run decisions we make today to solve the energy crisis has to also be in line with long-term mitigation goals. Otherwise, we risk creating infrastructure and carbon lock-in that makes it harder to transition to a low-carbon economy. Okay, thank you so much for your time and listening to our presentation. I hope you found it interesting.